Hi there. Welcome to video 2, which is going to be a summary of scene 2, and I'll just take you through what I want to do. First of all, I'll give you a little bit of a summary of the play in scene 2. Where are we? What new conflicts are we seeing? How's the plot moving on? What's happening in scene 2? Then we'll talk a little bit about where the conflicts are coming from and how they've developed from the previous scene. And then we'll talk a little bit about Williams and how he's achieving that. Okay, so scene 2. Scene 2 is the following evening, 6 o'clock the following evening. It's worth looking at how time progresses in this play. So this is kind of a day later. Blanche arrived in scene 1 kind of in the evening, and this is a day later. So things have progressed in that sort of sense. Stella and Blanche are about to go out to Galatoire's, a local restaurant, for supper, and Stanley has not been invited. So Stella has made Stanley his dinner and has left it in the fridge, and Stanley is not happy about that. So immediately there's kind of marital conflict at the start of scene 2, and that escalates as Stanley finds out about the loss of Belle Reve. So the loss of Belle Reve becomes this source of conflict that was there in scene 1 and it's still there in scene 2. Stanley doesn't take that well because Stanley has obviously married into Stella and Blanche's family, thinking that there's going to be an inheritance, and now he's finding out that there isn't. So Stanley wants to find out what has happened. How has Blanche lost the plantation? Has she done it on purpose? Is she swindling them? He uses that word. He doesn't like to be swindled. So then by the end of scene 2, in scene 2, Blanche is in the shower, which is a motif that we'll keep coming back to, or Blanche is in the bathroom. Stanley trashes Blanche's trunk, looking for kind of some evidence of her swindling them, and Blanche comes out to a big mess where he's thrown around all of her clothes and stuff. Then she asks Stella to leave and get a Coke, and again Stanley and Blanche are left alone to have a conversation about Belle Reve and where it's come from. So that's scene 2. In terms of what's going on for the conflict, we've got kind of 2 things going on here. So we start scene 2 immediately with a kind of conflict. Stanley comes in and immediately there's kind of aggro. So Stanley comes in saying, "What's all this monkey doings?" Stella tries to kind of neutralise it. She spends a lot of her time trying to neutralise conflict in this play. She kisses him. She says, "Oh, Stan, I'm taking Blanche to Galatoire's." She jumps up and kisses him, which he accepts with lordly composure. But immediately there's conflict because Stanley doesn't now know where his dinner is coming from if Stella is going to go out. I think it's worth there talking about context, isn't it? It's worth talking about this being a play of the 1950s, where you've got very traditional roles about gender and roles within a marriage. So it's I guess completely expected that Stanley would come in expecting his wife to have provided dinner. She has done. She's put a cold plate on ice and left it in the fridge for him, but he's not very happy with that because she's going to go out to a restaurant with her sister. He doesn't like the fact that Blanche is in the shower and can't be disturbed. And if you want to look at kind of patterns or things that Williams is doing, it's worth looking at the questions that Stanley asks. So there's lots and lots of interrogatives. He wants to know what's happened to Belle Reve. So again, if you look around page 16 and 17, you'll see lots of questions. The place in the country, yes. How? Stanley says so. Stanley keeps saying so. She didn't show you no papers, no deed of sale or nothing like that, huh? So there's lots and lots of questions. Well, what in the hell was it then? Given away to charity? A lot of the conflict in this scene comes from Stanley's continual asking of questions to Stella about Belle Reve. He asks her questions she doesn't know the answer to. He asks her questions that Blanche would know the answer to, until by the end she just kind of ends that conflict, like Stella on page 18, by saying, "My head is swimming," and then he goes, "All right, I'll wait till she gets through soaking in the hot tub." So you can see the conflict, the marital conflict there brewing through Stanley's use of interrogatives, lots and lots of interrogatives, lots of questions that he's asking. Then that kind of doesn't really satisfy Stanley, and the idea that he's being swindled by Blanche starts to make him angry. And again, if you look at one of the things that Williams is doing, he changes then, generally speaking, from this questioning kind of approach, lots of interrogatives, to like an imperative and declarative approach. So there's lots of imperatives and declaratives that Stanley's using when he stalks into the bedroom and pulls apart Blanche's trunk. The other thing to look for always with Stanley is in the stage directions, look at the verbs that William starts using for Stanley when he wants to ramp up the conflict in the scene. On page 18, tons and tons of verbs. He stalks into the bedroom, he pulls open the wardrobe trunk, he jerks out an armful of dresses. Page 19, he hurls the furs to the daybed, he jerks open a small drawer, he pulls up a fistful of costume jewellery, he kicks the trunk partly closed. Almost every action that Stanley does is loaded with conflict in that little moment there where he's destroying Blanche's trunk. It's the first indicator of kind of physical conflict and physical violence that we're going to get later on in the play. He's not physically violent towards Stella here, although he is later, but he is physically violent towards Blanche's possessions. He's kicking, he's hurling, he's jerking, he's pulling, he's doing loads of kind of violent actions with all of Blanche's stuff. Loads and loads of kind of imperatives to Stella as well. Open your eyes to this stuff. And then lots of declaratives. The treasure chest of a pirate, pearls, ropes of them. I have an acquaintance that works in a jewellery store. I'll have him here and make an appraisal of this. There's lots of kind of very decisive kind of sentence structures that Williams is using where Stanley's kind of trying to take control through his language. Interestingly, Stella, you could play this scene where Stella gives as good as she gets. Stella is not afraid of Stanley at this point. So Stella is not an entirely weak character. I think it would be a misjudgment of her to kind of think that. She gives it back to Stanley here. She says, "Shh, be still, Stanley. Don't be such an idiot, Stanley. You come out with me while Blanche is getting dressed." There's lots of imperatives back from Stella. This is more of a back and forth argument than you might think, especially from when we look at the play later. So Stella also is able to ramp up conflict with Stanley through her language. She calls him an idiot, she tells him not to do it. She isn't just kind of this weakling who is kind of totally cowed by him, not at this point anyway. And then you get this interesting scene between Stella and Blanche. Sorry, between Stanley and Blanche. And we see a different type of conflict. So Stanley almost kind of calms down for a while and he wants to get the answer from Blanche about what's happened to Belle Reve. They end up talking about relationships, and on pages 20 and 21 of scene 2, one of the big patterns to look out for is the use of metaphor when they both talk about relationships. On the surface, this conversation is not a massive kind of argument, it's not a conflict, but what Williams does quite cleverly is he sets up the fact that these two people are very different. Look at the way that Blanche talks about relationships and clothes. So if you look at page 21, they talk about past relationships that they've had. And she says, she talks about, would you think it possible that I was once considered to be attractive? These were a tribute from an admirer of mine. She says, I cannot imagine any witch of a woman casting a spell over you. Look at the language that Blanche uses for relationships. It's all very, very romantic. It's, these were a tribute from an admirer of mine. You're looking at almost like chivalry there, aren't you? Almost like King Arthur kind of times where a knight would give a tribute to a lady. That's the way she sees romance. I cannot imagine any witch of a woman casting a spell over you. She sees it as this like romantic thing where romance is where somebody casts a spell. And then look at the way that Stanley talks about it. I don't go in for that stuff. I once went out with a doll who said to me, "I'm the glamorous type." I said, "So what?" That shut her up like a clam. Some men are taken in by this Hollywood glamour stuff, and some men are not. To interest you, one would have to lay her cards on the table. Look at the metaphors that Stanley uses for love. They're all very straightforward, simple. Lay her cards on the table, that's like a poker metaphor or a card playing metaphor, much less romantic than Blanche's. He uses the word stuff when he talks about relationships. That stuff, it's kind of very dismissive. That shut her up like a clam, which is quite kind of almost aggressive, isn't it? They have completely different worldviews, and although there's not outright conflict in that scene, Williams is establishing that these two people have a very different worldview with the metaphors that he's using. And then Stanley loses his temper with her. So he booms on page 22, "Now let's cut the rebop." Again, you start to see in the stage directions and in the language that he uses, there's much more aggression in Stanley's kind of language. Look at the way Blanche responds to conflict from Stanley. Page 22. Stanley says, "There is such a thing in the state of Louisiana as the Napoleonic Code, according to which whatever belongs to my wife is also mine, and vice versa." Stanley is trying to kind of use the legal language to kind of baffle Blanche into kind of telling him about Belle Reve. She says, but you have an impressive judicial air." She sprays herself with her atomizer, that's her perfume, then playfully sprays him with it. He seizes the atomizer and slams it down on the dresser. She throws back her head and laughs. That's an interesting moment of conflict on page 22, isn't it? Again, it's not that she's cowed by this big bully, is it? She's almost flirts with him. That's her response. Stella's is to call him an idiot. Blanche's is to laugh and to flirt. So he says, "Tell me what I need to know," and she just kind of giggles and sprays perfume at him. He really doesn't like that, does he? He seizes the atomizer and slams it down. Look again at those verbs for Stanley, that he's kind of very forceful, isn't he, and dynamic in those things. And then he throws her love letters on the floor, and she says she'll burn them because he's touched them. And again, think about the way that Stanley and Blanche view the world. She's this very romantic person, isn't she? We've talked about that before. He takes the love letters, and she says, "Now that you've touched them, I'll burn them." She talks about the touch of your hand insults them. And Stanley is just totally confused by that at the bottom of page 23. What do you mean by saying you'll have to burn them? That again just shows that these two people are operating on completely different levels, isn't it? Blanche is this romantic who feels that her love letters are this sacred object that can't be touched by ordinary human hands. Certainly not by the kind of dirty hands of Stanley, who's this brute. So she, in her idea of kind of romantic love, is disgusted by the fact that Stanley has kind of touched the love letters. Stanley doesn't think like that at all, so he just doesn't even understand why she should be so upset that he's touched her love letters. He genuinely doesn't get it, does he? What do you mean by saying you'll have to burn them? So that's where the conflict comes from in scene 2. And again, what Williams is doing is he's building up this idea that we've got two characters, Stanley and Blanche, who are very opposite in lots and lots of ways. So they're opposite in terms of class and the way they speak. They're opposite in terms of their worldview and their view of things like romance. And they're opposite in the way that they act, aren't they? So Stanley is very forceful and violent. Blanche is quite kind of playful and flirtatious. So everything about them seems to be opposite, and that's kind of the source of the conflict between them. Just very quickly, because I've realised I've gone up to 15 minutes, I'm going to do the post-it thing again. I'm hoping that's useful as just things to take away from scene 2. So where shall I start? We'll talk about the use of imperatives that Stanley uses when he's trying to kind of explore Blanche's trunk. That's part of like the escalation of the conflict, where Stanley starts using imperatives, and also bearing in mind that Stella is also giving those imperatives back to Stanley. It becomes a bit of an argument. use of symbolism and metaphor. So Blanche uses these romantic, fanciful metaphors for her view of what love is, like witch of a woman and kind of tribute from an admirer, whereas Stanley doesn't use metaphor at all, he just uses stuff, doesn't he? And shut her up like a clam, I guess, he does use metaphor. Shut her up like a clam is a simile, isn't it? And he talks about laying cards on the table. The metaphor he uses is not romantic and is not kind of fanciful, is it? It's much more everyday. Use of dynamic verbs in the stage directions, I think, is really important, especially for Stanley when he's angry. All the way through the play, he stalks, he kicks, he slams, he snatches. He does loads and loads of those kind of dynamic verb things, which shows that he's kind of getting angry. I talked in the last video about use of low frequency lexis. So Blanche uses a lot of low frequency lexis, which is words that are not used very often. Stanley uses very high frequency lexis. Stanley talks in a more plain, ordinary way. Interestingly though, when Stanley is trying to impress people, he tries to use low frequency lexis. He tries to use this judicial language, the Napoleonic Code and all of those sorts of things. But it doesn't kind of work. It doesn't work on Stella and it doesn't work on Blanche. And Blanche, in fact, laughs at him for trying to use that low frequency lexis. So generally speaking, Stanley speaks in this plainer way and Blanche speaks in a fancier way, and that's kind of a way in which Williams uses to show the difference in class between the two of them. What you might want to look at is a concept called divergence. And just very briefly, it's not something Williams is doing. What Williams is doing is he's giving high frequency lexis to Stanley and low frequency lexis to Blanche. But we would describe that as divergence, where when two people talk, they talk on very different levels. So Blanche uses this low frequency lexis, longer words, more complicated vocabulary. Stanley uses this kind of dialect and very simple vocabulary, and the two of them diverge, and it's a way of showing that two people are very different. So we would describe the difference between Stanley and Blanche's dialogue as kind of divergence. So that's just a kind of a bit of a concept that might be worth thinking about. I've gone way over on my preferred time, but hopefully you stuck with me. That's a little summary of scene 2.